The carriage wheels groaned as they rolled up the gravel driveway of the Hargrave estate. To the villagers who watched from a distance, it must have looked like a moment of salvation, a poor orphan boy being welcomed into the arms of wealth, into the embrace of a family powerful enough to shape the very town around them. That boy was Elias. Barely 12 years old, his eyes still carried the dull glaze of a child who had seen too much loss, too much silence, where laughter should have lived. His parents had died in an accident no one cared to investigate, leaving him with no kin, no coin, and no choice. The Hargraves, wrapped in their grand reputation of benevolence, had announced they would take him in. To outsiders, this was an act of charity, a gift of fortune from a family of stature. But Elias knew the truth, the very moment he stepped through the carved oak doors. The Hargrave mansion smelled not of warmth, but of cold polish. The air was still, heavy with the silence of servants who dared not speak too loudly. Lady Hargrave, dressed in her pearls and pale smile, greeted him as though she were accepting a stray animal brought in from the storm. Lord Hargrave, tall and severe, studied the boy as one studies a ledger measuring cost against usefulness. "You'll sleep in the east wing," Lady Hargrave said without looking at him. "The servants will show you." The servants, not the family. At dinner that night, Elias sat at the long table, a golden chandelier blazing overhead. The food was rich, roasted meats and fine wines poured into crystal. Yet he was given a smaller plate, one meant for guests of lesser standing. Their children, Charles, Margaret, and Edward, watched him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Is he our brother now?" Margaret asked innocently. "No," Lady Hargrave replied, her fork cutting through tender lamb. "He is under our care, that is all." 2. Charles smirked, already sensing the hierarchy of the household. "So, he's like the stable boy, only indoors." A ripple of laughter moved around the table. Elias forced himself to chew, though the food stuck in his throat like stone. Days turned to weeks, and Elias discovered his role in the house was not that of a son, but of a shadow. He polished silver, fetched books, carried messages. He was not allowed in the drawing room when guests visited, nor permitted to sit in the carriage unless there was extra space. When the Hargrave children played, he was their opponent, their servant, their scapegoat. But Elias was quiet, observant. He endured the mockery, the cruel games, the whispers of charity case and beggar boy. What the Hargraves did not realize was that every insult was not breaking him, it was building him. Like stone under pressure, Elias was hardening. One evening, when the winter wind howled against the windows, Lord Hargrave summoned Elias to his study. The boy stood before the great mahogany desk, staring at the maps and contracts that covered its surface. "You're a fortunate boy," Lord Hargrave said, his voice cool. "We've given you food, shelter, and an education. Do not mistake this generosity for affection. You are not our son. You will never inherit anything from us. You will work. You will learn discipline, and in return, you will be allowed to remain here. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Elias whispered. But in his heart, another answer echoed. "I understand too well." The final betrayal came 2 years later. Elias had grown into a sharp-minded youth, excelling in studies, always finishing tasks better than expected. But his growing intelligence was not a gift the Hargraves appreciated. It was a threat. At 16, he was called into the dining hall, where the family waited. His small trunk sat by the door. "You are old enough to stand on your own," Lady Hargrave declared, her tone as polished as the silverware beside her. "We've done our part. You should be grateful." "Where will I go?" Elias asked, his voice tight. "That is no longer our concern," Lord Hargrave said. Margaret smirked. Edward whispered something cruel. Charles chuckled aloud. The doors closed behind him that night, with a finality that burned deeper than hunger ever could. Standing at the edge of the estate, the boy looked back at the glowing windows where the Hargraves dined without him. Their laughter floated into the night air. The world expected Elias to wither, to vanish into the gutters, like so many forgotten children. But in the silence of that cold road, Elias made a promise to himself. He would not simply survive. He would return one day, not as the servant they mocked, nor as the orphan they discarded. He would return as a force they could not see coming, wealthier, stronger, untouchable. And when that day came, the Hargraves would know the weight of every cruel word, every stolen childhood moment, every night he spent alone in the shadows. Elias whispered the vow into the dark. I will return. And when I do, you will bow. The streets did not welcome Elias. They swallowed him. On the first night after being cast out of the Hargrave estate, he wandered aimlessly through the narrow alleys of the town, clutching his small trunk like a shield. By morning, the trunk was gone stolen, as he slept on a bench by the market square. Everything he owned vanished in silence, leaving him with only the threadbare clothes on his back and the echo of the Hargraves' laughter. For days, he begged. The rich women passed him without a glance, their carriages splashing mud onto his shoes. The butchers and bakers gave scraps only when they wanted to clear their counters. He learned quickly that pity was not kindness. It was merely convenience. Hunger gnawed at his stomach until it became a permanent ache, and the cold nights taught him to curl into doorways like a stray dog. But it was betrayal, not hunger, that carved the deepest wound. One afternoon, a man with a kind smile approached him by the docks. He introduced himself as Henry, a tradesman, and claimed he needed an assistant. You're young, strong, come with me, he said, offering Elias a piece of bread. The boy followed, heart racing with gratitude. For a moment, he believed fortune had turned. That night, however, Henry's true intentions revealed themselves. The assistant's job was nothing more than being a decoy for thefts along the crowded markets. Elias was shoved into dangerous errands, forced to distract guards while Henry and his crew pocketed goods. When Elias refused, they beat him and left him bleeding in an alley. As he lay there, the stars above blurred by tears, Elias whispered to himself, "Never again. No one will use me. No one will cast me aside." That vow gave him strength. The next weeks were cruel but transformative. Elias scavenged knowledge from wherever he could find it. He lurked by taverns, listening to merchants argue about coin and contracts. He watched gamblers at the docks, studying how liars concealed their tells. He observed thieves, noting not their crimes, but their discipline and planning. Every lesson was stored away like precious treasure. Still, fate seemed determined to test him. One bitter night, weak from hunger, Elias stole an apple from a vendor's cart. His fingers were caught before he could flee, and he braced for the worst. But instead of dragging him to the constable, the vendor looked into his hollow eyes and sighed. "You'll die out here if you don't learn better." The man shoved him away, muttering, "Be smarter than this." It was not mercy, it was a challenge. Elias took it to heart. The turning point came on a rain-soaked evening when he stumbled into a small, dimly lit shop on a forgotten street. Inside, the air smelled of ink and parchment. Shelves bowed under the weight of books, hundreds of them, worn and whispering with secrets. An old man with silver hair and sharp eyes sat behind the counter, watching him with curiosity. "You have no coin," the bookseller said flatly. Elias nodded, ashamed. "And yet," the man continued, "you are not looking at the food in my drawer, you are staring at the books. Why?" Elias swallowed hard. "Because books cannot be stolen once they're inside your head." The old man leaned back, a faint smile curling his lips. "Wise for a boy in rags. What is your name?" "Elias." The bookseller introduced himself as Mr. Whitford, a man forgotten by society but remembered by his books. Something in Elias's answer struck a chord within him, for he allowed the boy to sit by the fire and read. One night turned into many. Elias devoured pages by candlelight, from histories of fallen empires to ledgers of trade, from philosophy to the ruthless art of negotiation. Whitford taught him more than words. He taught Elias how knowledge was power greater than wealth, sharper than any blade. "The mind," Whitford said, tapping his temple, is the only inheritance worth having. The rest can be taken. This, never. Under Whitford's guidance, Elias began to transform. He learned mathematics to track debts and interest. He studied rhetoric to turn words into weapons. He absorbed stories of kings and tyrants, of betrayal and vengeance, of fortunes built from nothing but cunning. Years seemed to pass in the cramped shop, though it was only a handful of seasons. With every book, every lesson, Elias felt the weight of his oath grow heavier. Survival is not enough. I will rise higher than the Hargraves ever dreamed. But Whitford was old, and time eventually claimed him. One morning, Elias found his mentor slumped in the chair, a peaceful expression on his face, his hands resting on a half-open book. Elias buried him in a quiet plot beyond the town walls, placing a single stone above the grave. The shop was left to him, not in writing, but in spirit. Elias sold some of the books to gather coin, rented the place to a clerk, and walked away with the beginnings of capital. It was a modest start, but a start nonetheless. On the day he left, Elias stood at the threshold of the shop, now shuttered for new use. He looked at the sky, where the clouds parted to reveal a pale light. I was their servant once, their shadow. But now, his voice was calm, almost cold. I will become the storm that drowns them. I will become the storm. He tightened his coat, stepped into the bustling city beyond, and vanished into the crowd. The boy was gone. What walked away was something else entirely. Time became Elias's most faithful accomplice. The boy who once begged for bread in the marketplace faded into memory. In his place emerged a young man of sharp mind, polished manners, and an unsettling calm. Elias understood that survival was no longer the goal power was, and power required disguise. From the shop's meager profits, Elias invested carefully. First in small ventures, lending coin at fair rates, purchasing parcels of neglected land at auctions, reselling them with tidy profit. His talent for numbers grew into instinct. By the time he was 21, whispers already followed him in business halls. The young man with the calculating eyes never loses. But Elias knew wealth alone was insufficient. The Hargraves valued reputation, status, and bloodlines. To strike them, he had to move among their world, like a ghost wearing silk. And so, he built the mask. He shed the name Elias in public, adopting one that dripped with prestige, Mr. Ashbourne. He crafted a new history, fabricated documents, and cultivated the illusion of distant, aristocratic relatives. Tailors dressed him in fine suits. Tutors taught him the subtle accents of the gentry. Every gesture, every word, was practiced until flawless. Yet behind the polished smile, the fire of vengeance burned. Elias studied law, not for justice, but to understand how to bend rules until they broke quietly in his favor. He mastered human psychology, learning how greed and vanity could be twisted into chains stronger than iron. He memorized every weakness of the wealthy, their reliance on appearances, their terror of scandal, their endless hunger for more. Society embraced Mr. Ashbourne eagerly. Invitations arrived to luncheons, dinners, auctions. His charm disarmed, his wit entertained, his coin persuaded. Within a few years, he was not merely present in the circles of influence, he was a fixture. To the world, he was a rising star, an enigmatic man of wealth. To himself, he was a blade being sharpened, and always, in the distance, stood the Hargraves. Elias kept his eyes upon them like a hawk. He learned of their enterprises, textiles, shipping, and landholdings. He studied their allies, their rivals, their debts. Charles Hargrave, the eldest son, had inherited his father's arrogance but not his discipline. Margaret married into nobility, but carried a restless temper. Edward, the youngest, squandered coin in gambling halls. The family appeared unshakable to outsiders, but to Elias, trained now in the art of scrutiny, he saw the cracks, hairline fractures in the marble facade. And so, he began to weave.
Through intermediaries, Elias purchased quiet stakes in shipping routes. The Hargraves depended upon. He funded their rivals' ventures, cloaking his involvement under layers of anonymity. He bought debts at discount, smiling as he watched their obligations migrate into his silent control. Piece by piece, their world became a house built on foundations he now held. But vengeance was not. Elias knew that. To destroy them completely, he must first make them comfortable, so comfortable that they would never see the storm until it struck. He courted allies close to the Hargraves, befriended their friends, charmed their acquaintances. At parties, he would sometimes catch a glimpse of them across the room. They looked upon him as one looks at any other polished gentleman, never recognizing the shadow of the boy they had thrown to the streets. The irony tasted sweet. Late at night, alone in his study, Elias would remove the mask. He would stare into the mirror, strip away the practiced smile, and let the cold truth emerge. "Not yet," he would whisper. "Patience. The noose must be woven tight." One evening, as rain lashed the city, Elias sat before the fire with a ledger in hand. His holdings sprawled across its pages. Investments, properties, networks of influence. He tapped a finger against the Hargrave name scrawled among them. Already, they were entangled in threads they could not see. Already, he had the power to pull and watch them stumble. But stumbling was not enough. He wanted them ruined. He wanted them stripped of everything: wealth, reputation, dignity, until the only thing left was the memory of the boy they had abandoned. The fire crackled, and Elias allowed himself a rare smile. The mask was nearly complete. Soon, the true game would begin. The Hargraves had always believed themselves untouchable. Their wealth stretched across shipping lines, textile mills, and sprawling lands that glittered like jewels in the county's crown. Their name carried weight in drawing rooms and courts alike. But wealth, Elias knew, was like a fortress with hidden tunnels beneath it. And he had already begun digging. The invasion did not come with armies or banners. It came silently, through ink on contracts, whispers in corridors, and signatures sealed in candlelight. Elias, masked as Mr. Ashbourne, moved like a shadow behind the curtains of business. First came the debts. The Hargraves had borrowed heavily to expand their textile mills, trusting their reputation to keep creditors docile. Elias, through a labyrinth of shell companies, purchased these debts at a discount. Overnight, he became the silent master of their obligations. Yet, the Hargraves never knew his face was behind the letters, demanding repayment. Next, he circled their estate, parcels of farmland, cottages, and woodlands that bordered the Hargrave manor quietly passed into his ownership. The villagers, who once bent knee to the Hargraves, now signed leases under Elias's companies to the family. It was invisible until one day they looked beyond their gates, and realized the land no longer truly belonged to them. But Elias was not content with economics alone. Revenge, he believed, must also be psychological. And so, he began to play with their minds. Anonymous letters arrived at the estate. Some contained half-truths about Charles's reckless gambling debts. Others hinted at Margaret's indiscretions whispered in society's corners. One letter even suggested Edward had conspired against his own father in a failed investment. The letters were unsigned, written in neat script, always delivered when suspicion burned hottest. The effect was poison. At first, the Hargraves dismissed them as nonsense. But when Margaret's husband indeed grew cold toward her, after a business scandal engineered by Elias, She began to suspect betrayal in her own family. When Charles lost another fortune at the gaming tables, his father accused him of leaking the truth to outsiders. At every turn, doubt crept between them, widening cracks into fissures. Even their business partners began to retreat. Meetings were canceled without reason. Long-trusted allies grew distant, offering only polite excuses. These shifts were subtle, orchestrated by Elias through his influence in merchant halls. He did not order their withdrawal outright. He merely whispered doubts, hinted at instability, and let the Hargraves' own arrogance do the rest. No, inside the estate, silence grew heavier. The once proud dinners, filled with laughter and command, now simmered with suspicion. Lady Hargrave, once a figure of composure, snapped at servants, convinced they were spreading rumors. Lord Hargrave himself grew paranoid, locking documents away, demanding loyalty oaths from his children. And all the while, Elias watched from afar. He attended the same galas, dined in the same halls, sometimes standing only a few feet away. To them, he was Mr. Ashbourne, an enigmatic gentleman of fortune. They had no inkling that the storm tightening around them was of his making. Elias would smile politely, offer small courtesies, and disappear into the night, just another face in the crowd, But in private, his cruelty surfaced. At his desk one evening, Elias drafted a final anonymous letter, not to accuse, but to taunt. It contained only 7 words, scrawled in perfect ink. Kyo. The walls close in from within. Kino. The letter was delivered to the Hargrave estate in a plain envelope. Lord Hargrave read it at breakfast, his hands trembling slightly, though he tried to hide it. His children exchanged wary glances. None spoke. And in that silence, Elias knew his work was succeeding. Kino. The Hargraves, once united in pride, now turned upon one another with quiet suspicion. Every glance became a threat, every silence an accusation. Their fortress was not being stormed. It was collapsing from the inside. From his study, Elias lit the candle and leaned back in his chair. Maps of their holdings stretched across the desk, each marked with notes, debts, and hidden hands pulling strings. "Oh, the invasion is nearly complete," he murmured. "They do not even see me. Not yet." Eek. The fire cracked, as if laughing with him. Elias closed his eyes, savoring the thought. The Hargraves were no longer masters of their world. They were prey, wandering deeper into the hunter's snare. The Hargraves had weathered storms before, but never one like this. Their fortune, once vast, now wavered like a candle in a draught. Every attempt to stabilize it seemed cursed. Charles, the eldest, staked what remained of his credibility on an overseas shipping venture. Elias himself had orchestrated the bait, an opportunity too perfect, too profitable to resist. But when the cargo vanished mid-journey, so too did Charles's reputation. Whispers spread of negligence, of incompetence. Partners withdrew, creditors circled. Charles returned home hollow-eyed, his father's contempt burning hotter than any fire. Margaret's downfall came not in boardrooms, but in ballrooms. For months, Elias had sown rumors of her indiscretions, feeding them like embers until they caught flame. When her husband discovered forged letters, carefully crafted by Elias to suggest infidelity, he cast her aside with public fury. The scandal spilled into society like spilled wine, staining her name beyond repair. Margaret wept in her chambers, blaming her brothers, her parents, even herself. never realizing the hand that penned her ruin. Edward, the youngest, continued his descent into vice. The gambling halls embraced him eagerly, and Elias made sure their tables were rigged. Edward lost fortunes he never truly owned, borrowing against the estate in secret. When the debts surfaced, Lord Hargrave struck him across the face before the servants. Edward spat blood and cursed his family's name, convinced they had betrayed him. First, no. The once mighty Hargrave estate, polished and proud, now echoed with shouting matches and slammed doors. Dinner became a battlefield. Lady Hargrave begged for unity, but her words carried no weight. Suspicion had hollowed out her children's hearts. Lord Hargrave himself grew gaunt, pacing his study through sleepless nights, muttering of traitors and unseen enemies. And then came the offer. A mysterious benefactor, a gentleman of means, expressed interest in rescuing the Hargrave empire from collapse. The offer was generous: loans at merciful rates, partnerships with prestige. Desperation left the Hargraves blind, and they seized upon the opportunity with trembling gratitude. But the benefactor was Elias. Behind a veil of intermediaries, he fed them coin. He already controlled, binding them with invisible chains. Every pound they accepted was another thread in the net. Their empire did not recover. It drowned quietly, each gasp drawing them deeper into his grasp. What Elias savored most was not the financial ruin, but the psychological collapse. One evening, through the open windows of their estate, he listened, unseen, as the family tore itself apart. Charles accused Edward of sabotage. Margaret accused Charles of betrayal. Edward hurled vile curses at them all, swearing he would rather see the family estate burned than bend to their control. Even Lady Hargrave screamed at her husband, demanding why he trusted no one. Lord Hargrave's voice rose above the chaos. It is not outsiders who destroy us. It is our own blood. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Kyle. Elias turned away into the night, his heart cold but satisfied. This was the harvest he had planted years ago: suspicion, betrayal, ruin. The family that once discarded him was now devouring itself, and still they had no idea that the shadow watching from the dark, the man who held their debts, their land, their fates, was the orphan they had abandoned. The trap was complete. Only the revelation remained. The Hargrave estate had once been a fortress of wealth. Golden chandeliers, velvet drapes, halls echoing with authority. Now, its windows were boarded, its gardens overgrown with weeds, its gates rusting on broken hinges. The mansion that had once stood as a symbol of power was reduced to a hollow ruin, foreclosed, abandoned, and forgotten by the world. No, it was here. Elias chose to end his game, through carefully worded invitations delivered by anonymous couriers. The Hargrave family was summoned. Each believed they were meeting the mysterious benefactor who had entangled their debts. Pride and desperation forced them to come. They arrived in silence, one carriage after another, stepping into the echoing carcass of their former home. Dust floated in the stale air. The great dining hall was stripped bare, its long table gone, its walls scarred where portraits had been torn down. Lady Hargrave clutched her shawl tightly, shivering, as if the ghosts of the place pressed against her. Lord Hargrave's voice broke the silence. Where is he? Where is the man who toys with us? The answer came in measured footsteps. Elias emerged from the shadows, his figure tall, his attire immaculate, his expression unreadable. The mask of Mr. Ashbourne still framed his face, but his eyes, sharp and burning, belonged to the orphan they had cast away. "Welcome home," Elias said softly, the words dripping with venom. Charles squinted at him, frowning. Margaret's lips parted in confusion. Edward scoffed, as though refusing to see the truth. Only Lady Hargrave seemed to tremble with dawning recognition, though she could not name why. "Ill." Lord Hargrave straightened, his pride flickering like a dying flame. "Who are you? What gives you the right to summon us here?" "Io?" Elias's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Who am I? I am the shadow you created, the boy you fed scraps at your table, the servant you discarded like waste, the orphan you condemned to the streets." The words struck like blows. Silence fell, broken only by the drip of rainwater through the leaking ceiling. "Well?" Then Elias stepped closer, his eyes never leaving theirs. "You dressed me in rags and told me I was fortunate. You cast me aside and told me to be grateful. You gave me nothing, yet from that nothing, I built an empire, and now every debt you owe, every piece of land you lost, every ounce of respect you once commanded, it all belongs to me." Margaret gasped, covering her mouth. Edward cursed under his breath. Charles shook his head in disbelief, but Lord Hargrave, his face drained of color, stared as though he had seen death itself. "This is impossible," he whispered. "No," Elias said coldly. "This is justice." Lady Hargrave fell to her knees. "Please," she begged, tears streaking her cheeks. "We were cruel. Yes, but we are still your family." "My family?" Elias's voice sharpened, cutting the air. "You never called me son, never called me brother. I was a tool, a servant, a stain on your name. You denied me humanity, and so I deny it to you. The Hargraves begged, pleaded, argued with one another, their voices breaking into chaos. But Elias stood unmoved, a statue carved from vengeance. He had waited years for this moment, not to kill them, but to strip from them the very thing they valued most, their pride, their legacy, their illusion of control. Finally, he spoke once more, his words cold as stone. "You took everything from me as a child. Tonight, I return the favor. Leave this house. Leave this name. From this day forward, the Hargrave family does not exist. You are ruins, just like these walls." He turned his back on them, dismissing them as they had once dismissed him. The echo of his footsteps filled the hollow mansion as the proud family crumbled behind him, their cries swallowed by the silence of their own downfall. Elias did not look back. The mask had fallen. The orphan had returned, and the oath was fulfilled, though the final stroke was yet to come.